Good evening. It's a great pleasure to be here again, my third time. And it's a great pleasure to talk about this tonight for the first time after the end of the Synod. I've collected many pieces of ideas, informations about the last month in Rome. And so what I will give you tonight is not an official version of what happened at the Synod, is not the standard criticism of what works or doesn't work in the Vatican. It's going to be a picture, my personal view of what has happened and what we can make happen as a church in the next step of the synodal process. I just want to start by saying that it's clear by now that the synodal process has produced something, that there is something that can be corrected, that can be improved in the process, in the mechanism, but it's the greatest sign of vitality in the life of the Catholic Church, I think, since the Second Vatican Council. It's an extraordinary thing that the Church has called for the first time members of all paths of life, of all backgrounds in the Church, in a limited way, but for the first time. So here, the first part will be an historical picture, how to locate this first assembly of the Synod in history. So here, one thing that we take for granted is how accelerated things have been in these last few years, how quickly things have developed, and we take this for granted, okay? So this Synod is important historically because I think we should look at that as the third step in Catholicism dealing with modernity, vaguely understood, that starts at the First Vatican Council, Vatican I, which was a problem that in the end produced the declarations on the papal primacy and papal infallibility. The second step was the Second Vatican Council, which was not about primacy, but was about episcopal collegiality, the bishops. And here we'll see one of the biggest differences between Vatican II and this Synod. Vatican II was a series of disputations, of debates, and clear votes with a majority and a minority. The Synod is something different, so it's this third step. It's the first post-Vatican II global event that is not about the papal primacy, is not about the rights and duties of bishops, but it's about the whole church. And it's not happened through disputations and debates, but with the method of the spiritual conversation, trying to accomplish the most difficult thing, which is to reach a consensus. The broadest consensus, avoiding carefully to create a majority party and a minority party. So this is due to Pope Francis' intuition that starts early in his pontificate in the first few weeks in 2013, but that becomes evident in October 2015 when he said, synodality is an integral part of the future of the Church, of the Catholic Church in the third millennium. This can be compared and has been compared by a theologian whose name is Christoph Theobald, German-French Jesuit, who said that the 2015 intuition of Francis on synodality is comparable to the intuition of Pope John the 23rd to call Vatican II in 1959. So historically, this is important not just in the history of the institution, but also of the idea. Why? Because the synodality that has been discussed at this synod now is a little bit different, or very different, from the synodality that was discussed in the early years of the theological debate on synodality in the 1980s, 1970s, 1980s, which was essentially an adjustment or an addition to the episcopal collegiality of the Second Vatican Council. It was about the rights of the bishops, basically. Now we have a different synodality. It's not about the bishops anymore, it's something else. It's something else also the synod that we see, because when you change the membership with voting rights of the synod, as Francis has done, from the previous membership, bishops only, you have a different kind of synod. And in the Catholic Church, we are naturally afraid of saying this is new, but this is new. This is a different kind of synod, and it's a different kind of synod that accomplishes, though, something that one of the most important bishops and church leaders of the post-Vatican II, the Archbishop of Milan, Carlo Maria Martini, Jesuit, said in the famous synod of 1999 for Europe. He said, after Vatican II, we have a few issues that are outstanding: the theology of sexuality, the role of women in the church especially, and we need something bigger than the Synod of Bishops. 1999. And back then, I remember the leadership of that synod rebuked him publicly, almost humiliating him. And now, 24 years later, this is what has happened, basically. So there are arcs in church history, and sometimes, if we look back, we see something that comes to fruition. So here, one of the things that Christoph Theobald has said in a book just published, said that this synod is very important in the church of today, because this church needs, in French he says, pacification, which can be translated as, reconciliation or peacemaking between different cultures, different identities. This is important because it's a very difficult thing to do, to reconcile, but it's also short of a revolution. Those who say that the synod is a revolution in disguise, I think they don't consider that there's a difference between reconciliation and revolution, and this synod is much more about reconciling different Catholic culture, the Catholic identities, and no one has actually talked about a revolution in the Catholic Church. So here there is, though, a reconciliation which is not less utopic than revolution, though. And so this is important because I think that the synod has been very important, because the Catholic Church, for all its faults and shortcomings, and it's one of the last public places where there is a destiny that can be decided together, with all limitations again. But it's one of the last public places where you're not an audience. You're not just an audience or an audience of consumers, but you're something else. So this synod is important to understand historically because it takes place because it continues in an historical moment that is very different from the one of the Second Vatican Council, which was, at least in the Western world, a time of hopes, of expanding horizons, of progress, les 30 glorieuses, of an expanding economy, and so on. So let's remember two things. One, that at least in Europe, the preparation of the Synod, the 18 months before the opening of the Assembly, has coincided with the largest war in European history since 1945. That had huge impact in Eastern Europe, but has cast a shadow on the whole continent, at least. Secondly, and even more importantly, and more, ominously, the 4 weeks of the Synod have coincided almost exactly, actually exactly, with the beginning of the war in Israel, in Gaza, exactly almost to the day. October the 7th was the conclusion of the first week, of the week of the spiritual preparation of the Synod, and during the last night of the Synod, the ground operation of the Israeli Defense Forces started in Gaza. This is really something different from what we saw, we as a church, and as an historian, I can say this, that was the beginning of the Second Vatican Council, which was a sigh of relief for having escaped the nuclear holocaust of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And now we are in a different situation, which gives, I think, us a certain responsibility to talk responsibly about what's happening in the church, what we want to happen in the church. We thought that after Vatican II, at least among Catholics, anti-Semitism was a solved problem. It is not. We thought that the clash of civilization was just a bad dream, and it's more than that. And so this helps us understand that the Synod takes place in a particular mood of the world where Christians are divided about these wars, that there are ecumenical divisions between churches that are deeper than what we saw at the Second Vatican Council. So here, second part, what happened at the Assembly in a few minutes. So here, what has been really different, as we all know, has been the consultation and the preparation of the Synod Assembly, a real consultation. Only a limited number of Catholics has participated, but it has been really looking for having the real voice of the real people, with one difference, again, if we compare that to the Second Vatican Council. At the time of the Second Vatican Council, there were different ways of being Catholic, but not so many as we have them today. It's a much more variegated, diverse spectrum of ways of being Catholic, of ways of having left the church, of ways of having become Catholic again, or for the first time. So that was more complicated for that reason. Organizing this Synod has been quite complicated because, as it has been said, this is a Synod on the Synod. I mean, how to be a synodal church, like building an airplane while you're flying. It's very complicated. So it's a meta-synod. But this is really part of the spirit in which Francis has built this Synod. And he chose, as the spiritual father of this Synod, Father Timothy Radcliffe, and for the first Jesuit Pope to ask a Dominican, that said something interesting. But this is interesting because this synod has been built more as a retreat than a voting assembly. And that is, it has pros and cons also. The preparation has been preceded by a variety of different synodal experiences around the world. Every country, every continent has done it in its own way. If you compare the German synodal path and what they've done in Latin America, or Australia and Italy, the cases that I know more, or the United States, they are all different. And this is not just something that will disappear. I think that synodality will be implemented in different ways. This is not something that will be a uniformity. This synod, the most important changes in the membership of the synod, as we know, has been the enlargement to laymen, to women, and this is the most visible. It was a minority, but it was not a token. It was more than that. Their voice has been really present and heard and visible in the synod and outside, and I think it will be heard even more. But most importantly is this. Below the largely, artificial distinction between those who are bishops ordained and those who are not, there is another kind of difference, which is this. At the previous synods and at the Second Vatican Council, you had bishops or members of the hierarchy that have the same rank of bishops, to be blunt. Okay. At this synod here, we had a variety of ecclesial types that were not really depending on ordination. So we had the representatives of the institution, of the ecclesiastical institution, cardinal bishops and priests, but also lay people who were there as representatives of the institution. We had members coming from the world of the pastoral care, which is not something that has been usual for the synods before. We had members coming from social and ecclesial movements. To be very clear, also those who know nothing about theology and very little about the church, but they have done the gospel. That's interesting. There were members of the people of God, young students, people who have no other qualification other than the most important, which is baptism from a theological point of view. And then lastly, there were theologians. Last and least in this case, because it has been a very particular role, the one of theologians, that I think, and I will say more at the end, will need to be clarified. Because it's not clear in this synod, and I would say more generally in the Church of Francis, what is the role for theologians, for academics. So here, the most important thing is this, that Pope Francis and the leaders of the synod wanted really this synod to be not an event, but a process. Not something that occupies the news cycle for a few weeks and then disappears, but something that creates a certain spiritual movement. This was part of the very strict media policy that was imposed, a policy of secret, that no one could say anything about what was happening in the synod. not during the Synod, not after the Synod. I'm curious if this will be respected for the next 11 months. So this was very important. I dare to say that it is something that it was a policy that was broken in some sense by Pope Francis himself with the interviews that he gave during the Synod, where he talked about issues that were being discussed at the Synod. If I can say that, that was a little bit of a double standard. So here, contrary to the previous Synod of 2014-15 on the family and marriage, and especially the Synod for the Amazon region of 2019, there have not been major incidents during the Synod, which is something that we have seen in 2014-15 with open letters challenging the Catholicity of the Pope, or something even more serious in 2019. We haven't seen that. We have seen, though, that the Synod has been preceded by the public response given by Pope Francis to the dubia of 5 cardinals, where Pope Francis made clear that on some issues, the direction of the Church in his pontificate has been taken already, and that has been a moment that has gone back below surface. We haven't heard about that or from them since, and this has been, I think, an interesting element and of success. Now, the Synod has produced 2 strange new kinds of documents. One is the letter to the people of God, which is basically the Synod and the Pope saying to the Church, stay tuned, this is not over. It is not more than that. A little more interesting was the synthesis that was published, voted and approved and published on the last day. And it's a document that some influential commentators have analyzed as the final report of the Synod. It's not a final report. It's an interim document which could have been less flat, let's say, but it's not the product of the Synod, okay? So here, I think that there is a legitimate criticism that has been made by some people who have an institutional voice that what we see in the document of synthesis at the end of the Synod says something on what happened during those conversations, not debates, but conversations at the Synod, in terms of a certain lack of theological depth. So I say this because I've heard this, but also I've read this by 2 members of the Synod, 2 important theologians. One of them is Piero Coda, who's the president of the International Theological Commission, who yesterday published in Italian one article saying we need more theology here. So here one of the limits of the Synod, it's that it has been an experience of sharing experiences and of trying to get a pulse of the Church. But there hasn't been a moment, or very few moments, of in-depth analysis of what it means to be a synodal church, what it means to be a church that is accountable, what is this new Synod about. And so this is something that I think will have to happen. And again, if we look back at the Second Vatican Council, this is something that is quite typical of some councils or some ecclesial assemblies. What happens at Vatican II, at the end of the first session, 1962, is that it's clear to almost everyone that the documents that had been prepared between 1960 and 62 were not adequate. And so what happens starting January 1963 is what a historian of the Council has called the second preparation of the Second Vatican Council, which is, by the way, exactly when we had the turn of the document on ecclesiology, which will become Lumen Gentium, which doesn't start anymore with first the hierarchy, just to send the message, but starts with first the church as a sacrament, and second, the people of God. And so this happens in the second preparation of the Second Vatican Council. I think something like that could happen in this period of 11 months of intercession. It's not clear exactly if there is a process, if there is... I think we will hear something about that, but it's not... It cannot be left to the personal initiatives of some bishops or some bishop conference. So here there is an analogy with the Second Vatican Council, because having at the first assembly and at the second assembly next year the same members, it creates a continuity and a sense of community, which is not what we had at other synods. So this is important because these bishops, cardinals, men, women, they have known each other in what I've heard has been a very intense, spiritual, personal experience. Differently from previous synods, this has been, again, a retreat. So they have gone to the catacombs, to the sanctuary. They have done things together. So there's an experiential component there, which was not there at the previous synod. So third part, the perspectives and the open questions. Now, I think that there is one big good news that comes from this synod, and the good news is that we are still a Vatican II church. We are still a church whose operative system, whose OS, is Vatican II with some updates. Okay, but that is, I think, the good news. On the other side, the bad news is that we are still at Vatican II, in some sense. So this is a complex picture. So here, I think that there are some clear answers that have come from this synod to questions that we had until a few years ago, about the future of church governance and so on. So it's clear Pope Francis has opted, and it makes perfect sense, for an aggiornamento, an update of the instrument of the Synod, which has a very ancient history, and it has gone through different phases, changes, but that makes much more sense than creating something totally new. And in some sense, the Synod, in the present form or until last year, is already a recent innovation that was decided by Paul VI in 1965. So we have a Synod, yes. We don't have a board of trustees of the Catholic Church, a board of directors, these kind of things. Second, Pope Francis has opted for an enlarged Synod, recognizing something that's very difficult to accept in the perspective of the Church of the Second Vatican Council, that a certain episcopalism of the theology of the Second Vatican Council has failed. Episcopalism meaning if we give more power to the bishops, the church will not become a dictatorship and everything will be fine. We have seen how that went in these last 50 years. Okay, so here, that has been a very courageous, and as it happens often in the Catholic Church, unspoken acknowledgement that the theology of the episcopate, episcopal collegiality, needed a correction. Third thing that has become clear is that Pope Francis doesn't want to separate the issue of the spiritual reform of the church and of the institutional reform. This is very complicated, but this is really part of the overall picture. Now, there are open questions, I think. So we know that this synod on synodality will have a second assembly next year. The future of this synod is not clear, not to me, I think to anyone. We do not know when we'll have another synod in 2027, 28, what kind of synod. This is really something that is really a magmatic situation in the Catholic Church. It's taking shape day by day, and we don't know if what the future of synodality will mean for other governance bodies in the Catholic Church, like the bishop conferences, who knows, the pastoral councils, the national synod. This is something that I don't think it's clear to anyone. Again, I think that there will be very soon, or already, the question if we want to have a synodality that is just an expression of the methodology coming from sociologists or leadership experts, or if we want a theology of synodality which is founded on a theology of the institution, of membership, of baptism, all of that. Now, to conclude, I think that what we are going to see is an extremely interesting and complicated experiment, because what the Catholic Church is trying to do here is to find its own way in addressing the modern sensibility of every human being on earth to be heard, to be respected, to be involved, to be part of this. And the Catholic Church here has to find its own way, which is different and will be different, I think, from the two other families of churches that have adopted their synodal styles. The churches of Eastern Orthodoxy, which have a synodality which is episcopal synodality, only bishops, and that Catholics tend to romanticize. This is a real problem. And on the other side, there is these synodal bodies of the churches of the Protestant Reformation that have chosen a more parliamentarian way. And both ways have problems. And so far, the Catholic Church has been more comfortable with the opposite problem of having lack of consultation. But this is really part of the big picture that we are trying to do in the Catholic Church here. So here, I think that what's at stake is how to keep together two things that in our cultural assumptions have become, unfortunately, incompatible, which is the institution, the power of governing, the jurisdiction, things that make things work. As Dorothy Day said, everyone wants a revolution and no one wants to do the dishes, right? And on the other side, the prophetic element. This is very complicated because if there's one thing that Christianity has done early on in the early centuries is to really fine-tune and make very effective a system of governance, of institution, of institutional working of the church, and has suppressed almost systematically the prophetic voices. We are in this situation here, which is, I think, much bigger than how to implement Vatican II, how to be a more transparent church. So here, I think we are at a very important juncture for the history of the Catholic Church, of Christianity, but also of our world. I think that it's important to remember that the Catholic Church is the most globalized community, and it's a community that is going through a massive process of de-Europeanization, and it's really trying to rearrange pieces that have been set for centuries, and now everything seems to be moving at the same time. So I'm very hopeful. I think what we have seen is very encouraging. There are some corrections that need to happen, and I think need to happen very soon. But this has been something that, as an expert on this, I would have never imagined a few years ago something like this happen. And of course, it's never enough. And of course, it has become really offensive that it's all about patience. It's all about, but something has happened already, and something is happening. So I thank you for your patience, and I'm looking forward to your questions and comments. Thank you very much.